Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarata Bashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherray. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Professor Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Professor Victor Fett.
Thank you very much, Nara. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce a special guest for our 163rd weekly meeting of Ukraine discussion group. Our guest is the former ambassador William Courtney, who is now adjunct senior fellow at RAND Foundation and professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. Dr. Courtney holds Ph.D. in economics from Brown University and BA from West Virginia University. I need to mention that he is a native of West Virginia, of our town of Barboursville. And Dr. Courtney has a lot of credentials, as you've seen in the announcement. From 72 to 99, he was a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Department of State, as well as ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. Dr. Courtney, we are eagerly waiting for your analysis of whatever current situation you care to analyze for us, and thank you for agreeing to talk to our group. Welcome.
Victor, thank you very much. I have to apologize. I had a cough. I've come down with a cough. And so I'm going to be a little briefer in my comments, and I may actually have to stop them at times if I cough too much. So I thought I would just make a few comments about the Russia-Ukraine war. Of course, we read about it every day. There's so much information in the media that there is not a lot of secret information that's unavailable to the general reader, actually. But just a couple of thoughts. First, how the war is going to come out is just unclear. We in Washington have made so many incorrect predictions at the beginning. The Ukrainians have surprised us on a number of occasions. For example, when the Ukrainians sank the Russian Black Sea flagship, Moskva, in April 2022. That came as a total surprise in the United States. We did not believe that, did not realize that Ukraine had that capability. Right before, just days before the Russian thrust in February 2022, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Milley, said publicly that the Russians probably could surround Kiev within 72 hours of the thrust, down from Belarus. There were thrusts on both sides of the Dnipro River coming down. Well, it turned out that, of course, the Russians failed in that effort. So in some respects, that was the first bad prediction, but there have been some others. So I wouldn't presume to say how this is going to come out. We just are unsure about the military situation. For example, in recent weeks, the Ukrainians seem to have pretty much stopped most of the Russian effort to regain territory. In preceding several months, the Russians were gaining more territory, although in comparison with the total amount, it was really a very small, almost infinitesimal gain of territory. The Russian military situation in the Black Sea while it's been stalemated on the ground pretty much since February 2022, with the exception of the Ukrainians taking back most of Kharkiv Oblast and part of Kherson Oblast west of the Dnipro River. It's been pretty much stalemated. But in the Black Sea, again, to our surprise, the Ukrainians have used a very skillfully combination of uncrewed surface vehicles, USVs, and uncrewed aerial vehicles, UAVs, to drive out much of the Black Sea fleet. So the Ukrainians have sunk or damaged about 1/3 of the Black Sea fleet, and most of the rest of it has been moved eastward in the Black Sea. So the Ukrainians, with no navy of their own, have really routed the Russian Black Sea fleet. That came as a surprise. At the beginning of the war, we thought the Russian Air Force, which was much superior to Ukraine's, would be able to achieve air dominance or at least air superiority over much of the battlefield, beyond the forward edge of the battlefield. But in fact, they have not been able to do that because ground-based air defenses have been so effective. So that was another surprise. So where the Russians are now militarily, they pretty much hold up in the area where they were after February 2014, when they took most of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast as well as Crimea. Now they've gained some additional territory in the more recent full-scale war, leaking up Crimea with those oblasts, but they haven't gained much territory. So this has been a big frustration in the Kremlin. Hardliners are upset with the Russian military, as we saw with Prigozhin's constant criticism of the military leadership. The hardliners show signs of being upset with Putin, that he hasn't been able to be more successful in what a lot of experts in Russia thought was going to be a quick, short war. Turned out to be now a grinding stalemate for them. The economic sanctions that the West has imposed on Russia have been far greater than the Russians expected. They've been more like the kind of sanctions that the West and Russia and China imposed on Iran before the Iran nuclear deal was concluded in 2015. So these are unexpected developments. On the Ukrainian side, millions, maybe 7 million roughly, Ukrainians have left for Europe, mostly women and children. And then in the occupied area, a lot of the Ukrainians that were there have gone to Russia either forcibly or voluntarily. So the number of people in Ukraine has gone down quite sharply. That was not expected. The Ukrainians have fought better than we expected. Based on our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan and those two wars, the Ukrainians have been able to use and adapt and improve Western military equipment and tactics and procedures much more effectively than the Iraqis or the Afghans. So they've made excellent use of the equipment. We have not seen signs of large-scale corruption involving the Western equipment that's gone in there, in contrast to what we used to see in Vietnam, for example, or the Afghanistan wars. So that's been a pleasant surprise. The strength of Europe in support of Ukraine has also been a pleasant surprise. Prior to the full-scale invasion, I think the United States was probably stronger in support of Ukraine than Europe. But now, as particularly with the recent political change in Washington, the Europeans are really stepping up. They have always provided more military aid total aid to Ukraine than we have, although we've provided a greater proportion of military aid. But now the Europeans are really picking up, seeing that the U.S. may not be providing much military aid in the future, and so the Europeans are stepping up really quite impressively. The Europeans clearly see Russian invasion of Ukraine as a direct threat to European security. And that was something that, after the 2014 invasion, the Europeans hadn't quite absorbed that as a direct threat to European security. But since the full-scale invasion started in February 2022, that has really taken hold in Europe. So the Europeans are beginning to prepare themselves now to basically take over maybe part or much or all of the responsibilities that the U.S. had been assuming in this war, depending on how much Washington decides to continue to support. There are some areas, particularly with regard to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, including satellites, for example, and then the Patriot long-range air defense missiles. Those are two capabilities that the Europeans are much weaker in than the United States. But they have a lot of capabilities in other areas. So this is unfolding. Most recently, we've seen that Zelensky has agreed with President Trump's proposal to have a 30-day ceasefire on the ground, but Putin has refused to do that. President Trump has sent Steve Witkoff, his longtime real estate buddy from New York, to have meetings with Putin. The third one is taking place, or did take place today. But we've seen no substantive move on Russia's part to take actions to agree to President Trump's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. So things are kind of stalemated there. The Trump administration has been reluctant to apply pressure on Russia for reasons that are not well understood by a lot of us in Washington. But the Ukrainians made significant concessions to President Trump's proposals earlier. So we will have to see whether Russia does agree to the ceasefire or whether the Trump administration applies more pressure to Russia to that end. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. I have a question right away from Dr. Leonard Deutsch. Leonard, please.
You have indicated that there has been a mass movement of women and children from Ukraine. Do you have any sense of what proportion of the population that consists of?
So I don't follow that closely. I think there are maybe a little bit over 30 million people in the unoccupied part of Ukraine now, roughly. I've seen numbers like 7 to 8 million women and children have gone west. Some of those, though, apparently have gone back. So I'm not aware that there are really good statistics there. But one of the happier results for those who do go west is that they are apparently absorbed quite quickly into the economy in Europe and into society and schools and things like this, in contrast to the situation when large numbers of Syrian refugees came to Europe over a decade ago. So there is a question, the extent to which they become embedded in the society where they're living now, whether they might stay there after peace is achieved in Ukraine and their husbands or other family members would join them there. I think a lot of Ukrainians are worried about their own country, that there may be too many of them who stay in Europe. But from the standpoint of individual families, they have to make their own decisions.
Thank you. May I follow up with one more question about the satellites that Musk had provided earlier in the war? Is the intelligence gathering still dependent upon those satellites, and are they available to the Ukrainians?
So it's useful to separate. The Starlink satellites are low Earth orbit, massive, large numbers of relatively small satellites. They are used primarily for communication. The intelligence satellites are usually, there are some of them at low, what's called LEO, the low Earth orbit, but others that are at mid-level or high, what do you call it, geostationary orbit. So the ones that the U.S. operates, many of them are at varying orbits, but quite a few of them are higher. So the Starlink is still working. It's provided a platform for encrypted communication between units on the ground, even very small units at the squad level. They can have a Starlink receiver terminal and be receiving and sending encrypted information. That's a real godsend. Without that communication across a battlefield that stretches well over 1,000 kilometers would be a real challenge for the Ukrainians.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Anara, please, you have a question.
Thank you very much for your insights. My question, I have actually three questions. First, what is the most likely scenario of the war, at least in the near future? The second question is, what the worst scenario for Ukraine? And the third one, what is the possible scenario after Putin or Trump time period? Thank you.
Okay, so I have to apologize. I don't make any predictions, so I have no prediction about what the likely scenario is. That's just unknown. As I mentioned, we have not been very good in the West about predicting, and I don't think the Ukrainians or Russians either have been so good about predicting how this would unfold. The worst scenario would be, of course, if the United States were to withdraw support, the Russians were to throw more resources in and take over more of Ukraine, perhaps up to the Dnipro River, or perhaps even further west, up to the area where, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Poland occupied. I think I have a sense that probably Russians are not so eager to dip into that area of Western Ukraine for fear of large-scale insurgencies. So the worst scenario would be a substantial Russian military gain. But right now, it doesn't look like Russia has that capability. They've thrown a lot of resources in. They're now pulling old tanks out of storage, T-62 tanks, for example, other BMP equipment that had been just locked, been put in storage for a long time because so much of their modern equipment has been destroyed in the war, and they are not capable of producing new modern equipment at the rate needed to replace the lost equipment. So we'll just sort of have to see how this goes out. After Putin or after Trump. So after Trump, the U.S. could go back to a policy of, one supported more by interventionists in Washington, whether that's Mitch McConnell type Republicans or Democrats or some combination of those. So something like what we saw before, or we could see a continuation of, more restraint, if you will. Starting with the Obama administration and moving forward, the U.S. has become more restrained in its overseas ambitions with regard particularly to the use of force. Well, in the academic world, there's a big debate between restrainers and interventionists. We have seen some amount of restraint, and I imagine some of that will continue. If Putin goes, it depends on how he goes. So let's look back to the Afghanistan war in the 1980s. The invasion was in 1979. In 1985, Gorbachev came to power, which essentially it was a liberalizing regime change. And then 4 years later, the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan. So there was no negotiated peace, there was no ceasefire. The Russians simply withdrew. That scenario could repeat itself if Putin were replaced by liberalizing regime change. Russians fed up with how much the economy is being weakened now. Standards of living are going to be declining even more rapidly in the future as the rainy day funds diminish in Moscow. So we could see liberalizing regime change, or we could see regime changing. I'm back still in the ex-KGB direction, which is what we have now, or some kind of hardliner. So again, it's hard to predict. We did not predict Gorbachev's ascension and his liberalizing regime change, and so we should not think that we're able to make a prediction now.
Thank you very much.
Katerina, please.
Hello, Dr. Courtney, and thank you for being here. You served as ambassador to the region, to Kazakhstan, I believe Georgia, right? Like, so you know what it's like to be on the ground in the foreign embassies in foreign lands and in that ambassadorial diplomatic role. What is I would imagine now that the ordinary day-to-day work of ambassador, well, it has completely changed for the United States officers ambassadorial team working in Europe. What the meetings that are happening in Saudi Arabia to try to negotiate a peace, are the day-to-day the ambassadors typically assigned to those countries involved in that, or is that a completely separate process and team?
So negotiations recently have taken place in Saudi Arabia, and Crown Prince bin Salman was participating in a marginal way. That was one reason for the meetings to take place there, is that Putin is under indictment by the International Criminal Court. So they could not go for meetings to a country where he might be extradited. So Saudi Arabia was one country, and that's a country that Russia works with on oil price issues. There may be meetings that will continue there, maybe not. It's hard to know. And then meetings, the meeting is taking place now, of course, with Witkoff in Moscow. He's seen Putin 3 times in Moscow. Evidently, Putin is, in essence, he's stringing along Trump now by agreeing to these high-level meetings, which is a little bit unusual for him to meet with somebody who's not a head of state like that. But Putin is trying to avoid the wrath of the Trump administration for not agreeing to this 30-day ceasefire. So the work of ambassadors is, in some respects, is very similar to what it used to be. What's different is that the communications mechanisms are a lot better now. So, for example, when I was active, we didn't really have the modern like Teams or Zoom, things like that. So this facilitates communications. But the basic reality is that in Washington, while big decisions are made in Washington, thousands, tens of thousands of smaller decisions can't really be made in Washington because Washington doesn't know enough about the foreign countries involved. It doesn't have, there may be a couple of desk officers back here for some country abroad, but most people in Washington, for example, can't follow day to day what's going on in Turkey. And Turkey is a very, country still undergoing convulsions here now with the arrest of Erdogan's primary political opponents and things like that. So the role of embassies, ambassadors, diplomats on the ground is still very substantial, and in some respects even more so, because the world has become more complex and, let's say, more dynamic after the end of the Cold War. A lot of situations involving political stasis held in place by the Cold War were released after the end of the Cold War. So in many respects, our ambassadors our embassy, for example, in Mogadishu, Somalia, is got being swarmed by lots of challenges over there. So they're still all quite active. And we've discovered, of course, now after the Afghan and Iraq wars, just as we discovered after the Vietnam War, that military interventions, long military interventions, are extraordinarily expensive and accomplish relatively little. So diplomacy, in some respects, more people now are appreciating the value of diplomacy because it's a lot less expensive than a military operation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yefim Somin from Boston, please. Our common viewer,
Yes,
Yefim,
thank you.
please.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. My question is the following. What would be your take on the state of the Russian economy right now, and sort of, from your point of view, perspectives and how that might affect the war? Thanks.
So I have to say I'm not an expert on the Russian economy now. I read Alexandra Prokopenko and others who write on this, but the what economists would call total factor productivity growth is probably pretty negative over there now, and it's getting worse because they've been spending down reserves while they have unemployment, low unemployment now because of scarcity of labor. The economy is producing a lot more goods that in turn don't produce other economic goods, military goods. So this is an extraordinarily expensive war for Russia, and Russia's ability to maintain living standards now, I think, is eroded pretty sharply, while wages have gone up because of the high salaries and signing bonuses being offered to their soldiers. The inflation has gone way up. I think I just read the other day that egg prices are now 85% higher than they were a year ago, and potato prices are 40% higher than a year ago. So in essence, the war increasingly is being funded by inflation, or another way to say it is funded by declines in standard of living. So this is going to put increasing pressure on Putin. But how much, to what extent does that lead to a political breaking point? Again, we're not able to predict very well, in part because there's no organized opposition forces in Russia. So that, as Lenin used to talk about, a spark. Russia may now become more vulnerable to sparks because there's absence of organized opposition. So what does happen could happen suddenly, unexpectedly, or both.
Thank you. I wonder if vodka has become more expensive as well. That would be a real spark.
Probably.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. We have a very lively and dynamic discussion. If you can stay for a few more minutes, I know you have to go before the hour, but I'm sure our panel might have more questions. My question right now, which I wanted to ask for a long time from someone with your experience, do you see any possibility of internal de-federation of Russia, as many hope, in forces that will pull it apart, starting from Caucasus and inner Muslim regions? And if so, would you think the West will be supporting these dynamics, because it clearly hasn't done so before?
Excuse me, sorry.
Yeah.
So the idea that Russia could break apart in a new thing, there's not, I think, at least in Washington, people don't see much, don't have high probability assessments one way or the other on that. Those we're just not able to do that. I mean, the North Caucasus, of course, is more restive, has been, but we haven't really seen that happen. More likely might be some restiveness that causes political change, probably in a liberalizing direction. Because you have to look back, other times that Russia has been overextended. For example, losing the Crimea War, losing the Russo-Japanese War. We've seen liberalization, Stalin's death, liberalization. So if there's going to be change, it was pretty clear Russia's overextended right now, especially with the war, but with other things too. So if there's going to be liberalization, if there's going to be change, it probably has to be in a more liberal direction. I mean, certainly Russia is going to want to recover its international oil and gas markets, for example, under any new government. Well, if that new government keeps troops in Ukraine, they're not going to be able to do that. So the constraints are pretty substantial on what a new government does. But whether that will lead to some parts of Russia to want to separate more, it's really hard for us to know, except that we would assume that in the North Caucasus there would continue to be restiveness.
Thank you. Leslie, please.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. The first one is rather broad-based. I'll start with that one, but basically, given your ambassadorial experience, as someone who's worked as an ambassador under both Republican and Democratic presidents and working to preserve the post-World War II order, what do you think of Trump and his administration's seeming alienation of our allies, particularly in Europe and NATO? And particularly the way that that's not just they're saying that Europe needs to pull its own weight and increase defense spending. I would agree with that. A lot of people have talked about that. But the way they're going about it is in this kind of vindictive tone, with Vance going to Europe and lecturing them about not being democratic enough, and small d democratic, obviously, and some of the things that they were also discussing in the Signal chat that they added the journalists to. So from your ambassadorial perspective, what do you think of that particular, basically that vindictiveness? And then there are the tariffs, which of course just add insult to injury, but that's kind of a different thing.
So Europe itself is, having some let's say, what we used to consider alternative right, alt-right political movements. And certainly we've seen in France and Germany now, the AfD in Germany has gained more power than it used to have, or greater votes than it used to have. And then Brexit. Brexit was an example of a wholly what we would regard as irrational activity by Great Britain. They've lost a lot of their international clout being outside Europe. The GDP in Britain may be 10% less now as a result of Brexit. So Europe is not totally stranger to what we're going through right now. But I think the Europeans are quite surprised at how well, your word vindictive, I think that probably is as good a word as any, about how the Trump administration is dealing with allies now, not just in trade, but in spending as well. And that includes Europe as well as Japan, for example, South Korea, others. So a question is really, to what extent is this going to be short-term damage, and that after a Trump administration, the U.S. will be able to recover its allies, relationships, and, with friends and allies? Or is this something that's longer term with more resentment in the sense of more akin to the isolationist sentiment leading up to World War II, which was more deeply embedded, and then only the shock of the attack on Pearl Harbor changed perceptions in the United States. At this point, it looks like a lot of Europeans do think this is an issue to worry about for a longer term. That they see the Red America, if you will, as turning away from traditional traditional American leadership of the free world. So it's a major concern, but much will depend, of course, on what happens after the Trump administration.
Yeah. And my second question, and I hope that this doesn't sound too conspiratorial, but there have been allegations by former KGB agents. There was one that was made in a book a few years back, and there have been a couple of more KGB agents or people who claim that they're KGB agents who've said that or suggested that Trump was in some way co-opted or influenced by the KGB during and after his 1987 visit to Moscow, that he was in some way made, maybe not an agent where he's taking orders from them, but he's maybe an asset, or at the very least he was in communication with people who were in the KGB, and they were potentially pushing various ideas on him, which he then perhaps also spread in America. I mean, after he came back from Moscow, he took out several full-page newspaper ads criticizing America's defense spending and policies. So what do you think of those ideas?
So it's pretty difficult to make any definite assessment of some of those things, including whether he's been recruited, for example, to be a controlled agent. But what we do know is that a number of his business partners, when he was in business in New York, a number of them were former Russian Russian business leaders, many of them having a shady background of one sort or another. And so some of those folks, were involved with Giuliani in his activity trying to oust the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine. So I think from the just standpoint of the people he's been doing business with in his business for some years, there's been a substantial Russian connection of folks who have been former or maybe current Russian business people.
And then, of course, there's Paul Manafort.
Yeah, so the Manafort, and then I forgot the names of there are two of them, the pictures with Putin, with Trump and those guys, they're Russian emigres in New York who were closely involved with Trump in some real estate transactions in New York. There was another one, Dmitry Rybolovlev, who purchased a condo that Trump owned in Florida for substantially more than it was worth, for example. So there have been a number of those folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Courtney. We know you need to go, and thank you for being with us today and answering at least a few of questions which I think are of general interest as we find ourselves in this very strange segment of history. If you can give us the final word of wisdom, what would it be?
So I guess final word of wisdom would be that the importance of universities maintaining their integrity has never been greater than it is now. And so it's very important for the academic sector to retain both its strength, the terms of investments in research and development, things like that, as well as its integrity in making decisions about academic freedom and things like that. So this is unrelated to our conversation, but universities are on the spot now more than they typically are.
Oh, yes. And we have seen it in history before, haven't we? The role
Yes.
of centers of education.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and
Okay.
from us all and our little group here in West Virginia, and we assure you that village of Barbersville is still going strong.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Victor. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Shrey, please.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня прощаємося.
So my
Slava
wife is
Ukraini.
from Ukrainka also.
Героям слава.
Okay. Take care.
Very good. Thank you. And this concludes our session for today. This was